Alright, so let's talk a little bit about credit cycles. So, credit cycles are essentially just the changes in lending and borrowing behavior in an economy. Essentially, what happens is, as if with stocks, we have bull markets and we have bear markets where stocks go up and stocks go down. And for the general wider economy, we have growth, expansions, and contractions. The same kind of happens with the loans market, which we just call the credit cycles. And for the most part, the credit cycles kind of follow these economic downturns and upturns, but with a few exceptions. And these exceptions happen because credit cycles are a little more sticky in the sense that the impacts of loans will affect how much money can be loaned out and how much money can be borrowed in the future. So it kind of lags behind the economic cycles. Like with economic cycles, we'll just simplify it to four categories, which is expansion, peak, contraction, and recovery, and it's quite self evident what each of those cycles mean. So let's just take a look at expansion and peak stages of the credit cycle. Essentially, we can pair them up as one, which is basically expansionary policies. So in these periods, what we tend to see is very high liquidity, and what liquidity essentially means for the economy is that money is just moving more freely. So if it's high liquid, it just means people are very optimistic about the economy. They're investing a lot, they're putting a lot of money for businesses, they're also spending more as well. And what that means for loans is that the loan to value ratio of houses is very high because cash is worth a lot less when liquid is very high. And since money moves around more freely, investments become easier and refinancing also becomes easier. So it's easier for you to roll over a loan or something like that. And this is essentially what happens when the economy is expanding. So the reason that banks give out such high loan to value ratios is that they kind of overestimate the value of the property you're putting down as collateral. And this is because they assume the property will continue to go up as it is going up during the expansionary economic stages. But we know that this is not really always the case, which brings us to the next stage, which is the peak stage. And much like the expansionary stage, we see the same trends in loan to value ratio and easy refinancing. But at this stage, the banks are essentially lending out way too much money. So what we see is we're overlending, underwriting, and speculatively lending. What does that mean? Overlending just means the banks are lending more than they actually should, given that they don't actually know what like how many people will default on the loan. So they're lending way more money than they actually should. Underwriting just means the checks and balances that usually happen when you give out a loan are not done to the standard that they really should. Essentially, if you put down a house for 500k, the bank will be willing to give you a 500k loan instead of saying, "Oh, we need the value of the property to be significantly higher than the value of the loan just in case you default on the loan." So that's underwriting. And speculative is what I kind of mentioned before in the sense that the banks overwrite the value of the property because the property has been going up in the few previous years and they assume this trend will continue, which is not really what you should be doing if you're a bank. And obviously, to this standard, there will be exceptions, especially when the bank has hit like lending quotas and whatnot. But overall, we can see that the bank is lending out too much. They're lending out riskier loans, and they're lending out speculative loans, which are also just more risky. And for the most part, this is actually fine. It's a great way to expand how much money you lend, and it's good business for the bank. However, the problems arise when we get into the contraction stage of the credit cycle. This is when there are economic downturns and money becomes a lot less harder to come by. So essentially, what happens is we encounter low liquidity, and as in high liquidity, meaning money moves around more freely, low liquidity means there's no confidence, no lending, and no investing. Basically, people are holding on to money, or it's very sticky. It's very hard to move money around. So, like before, there's a contrast now in the sense that we are not really able to refinance anymore. It's very hard to get rollover loans, and as a result, there's lots of defaults for the banks. And because liquid is so much more valuable in this stage, loan to value ratios will be much lower in the sense that if you want to borrow $500,000 from the bank, now you might have to put down a house worth $800,000 as a collateral. So essentially, during this stage is when we get low loan to value ratios, and it's hard for us to do anything that requires a lot of money, especially lending. And this also means that lending rates go up. After this stage, we go into recovery, Where liquid is uneven, this is kind of mixed signals because some banks will be willing to lend out because they think the economy is recovering, while others will be much more cautious as they had a lot of theirs default in the previous cycle. So banks are usually more cautious in this stage. Alright, so what does this actually mean for us as investors in the real estate market trying to buy depreciated assets, essentially? So when we look at this from an investment perspective, there's only a few things you need to pay attention to, which are basically liquid and loan to value ratios. During the recovery stage, it's actually kind of hard to know where these things are at because it'll depend on the different banks and the different people we're dealing with. So it's kind of a mixed bag. But the other three stages, it's pretty clear what we should look out for. And before we continue, I should also mention that after recovery, we'll go right back into expansion. But I hope that was communicated through the diagram. Anyways, during expansion and peak periods, that's when the loans have the best loan to value ratio, as in high loan to value ratios. So if we're going to buy assets that are about to default, it's best that we buy assets that were dealt with during this period, because during this period, the value of the loan is much less than it should be. And so if we buy the loan, in return, we're getting more value compared to the value of the property. No.